In 1947, the winds of a harsh winter swept through the desolate moors of County Clare, Ireland. The country was still recovering from the economic toll of its neutral stance during the Second World War, while old superstitions lingered like the mist that blanketed the hills. In the quiet village of Kilbaha, perched where the Shannon estuary meets the wild Atlantic, lived the Sullivan family. They were unremarkable by the village's standards. Thomas Sullivan worked as a lighthouse keeper on the treacherous Loophead Peninsula, a place where many ships had met their doom against its jagged rocks. His wife, Margaret, maintained their modest stone cottage and cared for their twin daughters, Eileen and Bridget, who had just turned 10 that October. The twins were identical in every way. The same fiery red hair, the same constellation of freckles across their noses, and the same emerald green eyes that seemed to reflect the Irish landscape. The only way to tell them apart was the small crescent-shaped birthmark on Eileen's right wrist and their personalities. Eileen was outgoing and mischievous, while Bridget was quieter, more contemplative, often gazing off as if seeing things others couldn't. But it was their unique bond that caught the attention of the villagers. The girls hardly spoke to each other, but through glances, subtle gestures, and shifts in posture, they understood each other perfectly. It was as though they shared one mind between two bodies. "It's unnatural," whispered Moira Bryan, the local shopkeeper's wife, to the others after church. "They know each other's thoughts. My Johnny saw them by the old well last Tuesday." One of them cut her finger. Mary Connolly, the village's eldest woman, would reply, her old eyes narrowing. Before she made a sound, the other came running with a handkerchief. The old magic's in them. The ancient Irish had twins who could speak without words. Thomas and Margaret dismissed such talk. They believed in the natural bond twins shared, having spent every moment of their lives together. But on November 13th, 1947, everything changed. The day began like any other. Thomas had just returned from his 3-day shift at the lighthouse and was resting. Margaret sent the girls to collect driftwood from the beach, a chore they enjoyed. "Be back before the tide turns," Margaret called as they skipped down the rocky path, their woolen coats fluttering in the wind. "And stay away from the caves." The caves she mentioned were deep fissures in the cliffs a mile down the shore. When the tide came in, they flooded rapidly, trapping many over the years. Some had never returned. The twins waved without looking back, already communicating silently, their shoulders brushing together as they walked. 4 hours later, Margaret paced the kitchen, her hands twisting her apron nervously. The tide had turned, but the girls hadn't returned. Alarmed, Thomas gathered a search party, and lanterns swung in the dimming light as the men set out to the beach. It wasn't until nearly midnight that they found Bridget. She was huddled in a hollow between two rocks, soaking wet, her lips blue with cold, her eyes wide and vacant. Eileen was nowhere to be found. "The cave," Bridget whispered when they wrapped her in blankets and carried her home. That was the only word she spoke for days. The search for Eileen continued for weeks, combing the coastline and exploring every cave. Fishermen dragged nets along the seabed and prayer vigils were held. But Eileen vanished without a trace. Slowly, life in Kilbaha returned to normal, but not for the Sullivan family. Margaret remained bedridden for nearly a month, her once vibrant eyes hollow with grief. Thomas requested a transfer to an inland position and turned to drink when his request was denied. As for Bridget, she changed in unsettling ways. The once quiet twin became even more withdrawn, spending hours staring at the ocean from her bedroom window. She refused to speak even to her parents. But the villagers began to notice something odd. At the grocery store or after church, they saw Bridget appearing to converse with someone invisible, her lips moving, her hands gesturing, her face changing with emotion. "She's talking to Eileen," Mary Connolly declared one evening at the pub, causing a hushed silence. "The dead twin is still with her." "Stop spreading such nonsense," her son scolded. But he couldn't meet anyone's eyes as he spoke. He'd seen Bridget too talking earnestly to an empty chair the day before. By the spring of 1948, the rumors were rampant. Some claimed Bridget was possessed. Others said she'd gone mad with grief. The superstitious whispered that Eileen's ghost was haunting her, unwilling to cross over. Desperate, Margaret took Bridget to a doctor in Ennis who diagnosed her with a nervous condition caused by the trauma of losing her twin. "She's created an imaginary version of her sister to cope with the loss," the doctor explained. "It's common in extreme grief, especially with children. She'll outgrow it." But Bridget never outgrew it. If anything, her conversations with the invisible Eileen grew more frequent and vivid. She set a place at the table for her missing sister. Bridget continued to bring 2 jumpers whenever the weather turned cold, as though she were expecting someone else to need them. She would laugh suddenly in empty rooms, and when questioned, she'd explain, "Eileen just told me a funny story." But on the 1-year anniversary of Eileen's disappearance, something even more unsettling happened. Thomas Sullivan, stumbling home from the pub in the early hours, found Bridget standing at the edge of the cliff near their home, her nightgown billowing in the wind, apparently arguing with thin air. "She says she needs me to come with her," Bridget told her father when he grabbed her arm and pulled her back from the edge. "Eileen says she's lonely where she is." From that moment on, the Sullivans took turns watching Bridget day and night. Margaret sought help from doctors and even the parish priest, who performed a blessing on both Bridget and their home. But nothing changed. Bridget continued to converse with her missing twin, sometimes growing frustrated or angry when her parents couldn't hear or see what was to her perfectly clear. "She's right there," Bridget would shout, pointing at an empty corner of the room. "Why do you pretend you can't see her? She's right there." As the second year without Eileen began, a new doctor suggested sending Bridget to a special hospital in Dublin for children with nervous disorders. Margaret was hesitant, but after Bridget was once again found at the cliff's edge on a stormy night, she finally agreed. The night before Bridget was to leave for Dublin, something woke Thomas from a restless sleep. A cold draft swept through the cottage, even though all the windows were shut against the March chill. Thinking the front door had blown open, he got up to check. In the main room, he froze. Bridget sat cross-legged on the floor in her nightgown, a candle flickering before her, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. She was speaking softly, her words forming small clouds in the unnaturally cold air. "I know, Eileen. I know you didn't mean to go into the cave alone. I should have followed you right away." Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, the hairs on his arms standing on end. "No, I can't come with you yet." Bridget continued, responding to words only she could hear. "Mom and Dad need me here. They've already lost you. They can't lose both of us." She paused as though listening to a response, then shook her head firmly. "That's not fair, Eileen. You chose to go deeper into the cave. I called for you to come back." Another pause, longer this time. "I miss you too, every day. But you need to stop asking me to come to where you are. I'm not ready." Thomas finally found his voice. "Bridget," he said hoarsely. "Who are you talking to, child?" Bridget turned to him, unsurprised to see her father there. In the candlelight, her face looked older, wearied in a way no 11-year-old's face should be. "I'm talking to Eileen, Dad. She visits me every night now. She's getting stronger." Thomas took a step forward, fighting the urge to run back to his bed and pull the covers over his head. "There's no one here, Bridget. It's just you and me." Bridget smiled sadly. "She's right beside me, Dad. She's touching your sleeve right now." Thomas felt something, then the lightest brush against his right arm, like the wing of a moth. He jerked back, his heart racing. "This has to stop," he said roughly. "Your sister is gone, Bridget. Gone. And tomorrow you're going to Dublin to get the help you need." "She doesn't want me to go to Dublin," Bridget replied calmly. "She says if I go, she won't be able to find me anymore. She needs me to stay in Kilbaha." "Well, that's too bad, isn't it?" Thomas snapped, fear turning to anger. "Your mother and I are still in charge, and we say you're going." He strode forward and blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. "Now back to bed with you. We're leaving early in the morning." As Bridget brushed past him toward her bedroom, she whispered, "Eileen says you'll be sorry if you send me away. She says bad things will happen." Thomas didn't sleep that night. The next morning, as the Sullivan family prepared to leave for Dublin, a fierce storm blew in from the Atlantic. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled ominously overhead. "Perhaps we should delay the journey," Margaret suggested, looking anxiously at the darkening sky. "No," Thomas replied firmly. "We're going today as planned. The doctor is expecting us." As they loaded their bags into the borrowed car, Bridget stood perfectly still in the rain, her face turned toward the ocean. "She's crying," Bridget said to no one in particular. "Eileen is crying." Thomas took his daughter by the shoulders. "That's enough, Bridget. Get in the car now." The drive to Ennis, where they would catch the train to Dublin, was treacherous. The narrow coastal roads were slick with rain, and strong gusts of wind threatened to push the car off course. Inside, an unnatural cold seemed to permeate the air despite the season. "It's freezing in here," Margaret complained, pulling her coat tighter. "Is there something wrong with the heater?" Their neighbor Michael Flaherty frowned as he drove. "It's working fine. I don't feel any cold." But both Thomas and Margaret were shivering, their breath visible in the air between them. In the back seat, Bridget seemed perfectly comfortable, humming softly to herself, or perhaps to someone else. They were halfway to Ennis when the accident occurred. As Michael navigated a sharp bend in the road, the steering wheel suddenly jerked from his hands. The car swerved violently, breaking through the low stone wall and tumbling down the hillside toward the ocean. Time slowed as the car rolled over and over. Thomas heard Margaret scream, felt the sickening sensation of weightlessness. And through it all, strangely, he heard laughter. High, childish laughter that couldn't have come from any of the car's terrified occupants. When Thomas regained consciousness, he was lying on his back in the rain, some distance from the wreckage. His head throbbed and blood trickled down his face. With great effort, he raised himself onto his elbows. Margaret lay nearby, unconscious but breathing. Michael Flaherty was slumped over the steering wheel, but there was no sign of Bridget. Bridget, Thomas called weakly. "Bridget, where are you?" He struggled to his feet, swaying with dizziness. The wreckage of the car lay crumpled against a large boulder, but there was no sign of his daughter. Bridget, Thomas called again, his voice breaking with desperation. A flicker of movement caught his eye, pale blue fabric, the unmistakable color of Bridget's dress, vanishing over the crest of a small hill toward the ocean. He stumbled after it, his legs buckling beneath him with each unsteady step. When he reached the top of the hill, he saw her. Bridget stood at the edge of a small cliff no more than 15 feet above the churning sea below. But she wasn't alone. For just a fleeting moment in the dim light of the storm, he saw another figure beside her, a girl with the same fiery red hair wearing a torn and waterlogged dress. As Thomas watched, his heart sinking into his chest, the figure turned slightly, revealing a face identical to Bridget's in every detail. Then, as if guided by an unseen force, both girls stepped off the edge of the cliff. "No!" Thomas screamed, lunging forward, but his injured leg gave way and he collapsed to the ground. When he finally managed to drag himself to the cliff's edge, there was nothing below but the angry, white-capped waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks. The search for Bridget Sullivan lasted longer than the one for her twin had a year and a half earlier. This time, the entire country took notice. The newspapers in Dublin ran the story for weeks. "Second twin vanishes in coastal mystery," the headlines declared. Psychic investigators and spiritualists flooded the small village of Kilbaha, much to the discomfort of the locals. Thomas and Margaret, both still recovering from the crash that had claimed the life of Michael Flaherty, were surrounded by reporters and curiosity seekers. But the prevailing theory seemed to be that Bridget, mentally unstable after her twin's disappearance, had taken her own life by jumping into the sea. Thomas, however, knew what he had seen. He told no one except Margaret, who believed him without hesitation. They both knew there had been something unnatural about the accident, about the cold in the car, about the way the steering wheel had moved of its own accord. 3 months after Bridget's disappearance, when all hope of finding her body had nearly vanished, a young boy fishing along the coast made a discovery that reignited the mystery. In a small cave, accessible only during the lowest of tides, he found a child's shoe, the left shoe of a pair that Margaret immediately identified as belonging to Eileen, the first twin to disappear. The cave was thoroughly explored this time with modern equipment brought in from Dublin. Deep within its recesses, in a chamber that flooded completely, except during the most extreme low tides, they found something else. A small alcove that remained dry, even during high tide, containing what looked like a child's den. There were trinkets carefully arranged on natural shelves in the rock, pretty shells. Unusual pebbles, a doll missing one arm, and most disturbingly, pages torn from the Sullivan family Bible. Specifically, the pages containing passages about Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau and other biblical twins. "She was alive," Margaret whispered when the items were brought to her. "All that time, my Eileen was alive in that cave." The investigators were skeptical. How could a child survive for nearly 18 months in a sea cave? Where did she get food and fresh water? How did she endure the winter cold? And if she was alive, where was she now? The mystery deepened when, during several consecutive low tides, they discovered something else. Scratch marks on the walls of the narrow passage leading to the hidden chamber, as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way out when the tide rushed in. Near these marks, carved deliberately into the stone, were 2 names: Eileen and Bridget. The village of Kilbaha split into factions. Some believed that Eileen had somehow survived her initial disappearance, living secretly in the cave until she lured her sister to join her. Others thought that Bridget, in her grief and mental instability, had created the cave shrine herself, perhaps during multiple secret visits, before eventually taking her own life. The local priest offered a third, more disturbing theory, that something ancient and malevolent had taken both girls, something that dwelled in the caves and the dark waters of the Atlantic. It was a theory he shared only with Thomas one night, over whiskey. "There are older things in Ireland than Christianity," Father Donnelly said gravely. "The old ones who lived here before us knew not to let their children wander alone by the sea, especially twins. Twins were special to them, sacred, but also dangerous, too close to the other world." Thomas Sullivan sold their cottage the following week and moved with Margaret to her sister's home in Cork, far from the sea and its mysteries. Years passed. The story of the Sullivan twins became a local legend told to tourists visiting the remote coastal village. Occasionally, reporters or paranormal enthusiasts would arrive to reinvestigate the case, but they always left with more questions than answers. Thomas and Margaret Sullivan died within months of each other in 1963, having never recovered from the loss of their daughters. They were buried in Cork, though a memorial stone was placed in the Kilbaha Cemetery, bearing the names of both Eileen and Bridget. And there the story might have ended, fading into local folklore, were it not for what happened in the summer of 1977, 30 years after the first disappearance. Sean Ali, a graduate student in folklore at Trinity College Dublin, traveled to Kilbaha to collect local legends for his thesis. The story of the Sullivan twins particularly intrigued him, combining elements of fairy abduction, ghostly manifestation, and psychological trauma. He spent weeks interviewing elderly residents who remembered the Sullivans, poring over newspaper accounts and exploring the coastline where the twins had vanished. Most of the caves mentioned in the accounts had collapsed over the decades, eroded by the relentless Atlantic waves. On his last night in the village, Sean visited the local pub, buying rounds for the old men who still remembered the events of 1947. As the hour grew late, and the whiskey flowed freely, one elderly fisherman, Michael Collins, no relation to the revolutionary, as he was quick to point out, pulled Sean aside. "There's something about the Sullivan girls that no one ever puts in the official accounts," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper despite the noisy pub. "Something I saw myself with my own eyes the night before the second twin disappeared." Sean leaned in eagerly, the tape recorder in his jacket pocket still running. "What did you see, Mr. Collinson?" The old man glanced around nervously before continuing. "I was out late that night checking my lobster pots. It was a calm night, unusual for March. The moon was nearly full, casting a path across the water. As I rowed back to shore, I saw them. Two girls identical down to their hair ribbons, standing hand in hand on the beach near the Sullivan cottage." "You saw both twins?" Sean clarified, his pulse quickening. But Eileen had been gone for over a year by then. Collins nodded, taking a long swallow of his whiskey. "That's right. But there they were, plain as day in the moonlight. I thought I was seeing things." At first, Collins murmured, his voice thick with the memory. "I stopped rowing and just watched them. They were talking to each other, heads close together, like they were sharing secrets. Then they looked up, both of them, and stared right at me." The old man shuddered, his eyes wide, as if he could still see it. Their eyes caught the moonlight shining like a cat's eyes do. "That's when I knew something wasn't right," he continued. "No human eyes reflect light that way." Sean tried to mask the skepticism in his voice. "Could it have been Bridget with another girl? Maybe a cousin or friend?" Collins shook his head firmly. "The Sullivans had no relatives nearby, and besides, I knew those girls since they were babies. It was them, all right. Eileen and Bridget identical. But here's the thing that's haunted me all these years. One of them wasn't casting a shadow in the moonlight. One of them wasn't really there, if you take my meaning." Sean recorded several more stories during his time in Kilbaha. Fishermen spoke of hearing children's laughter from empty stretches of beach at night, and locals mentioned glimpsing two red-haired girls holding hands near the cliffs, only to find no one there when they looked again. Most disturbing were the reports from the 1950s and 60s of other children going missing for hours or days, returning with strange tales of playing with the Sullivan girls in secret caves or hidden coves. When Sean returned to Dublin with his research, his thesis advisor was impressed with the thoroughness of his work, but skeptical of his conclusions. "You're not seriously suggesting that these twins are still haunting the coastline 30 years after their deaths?" the professor asked, peering at Sean over his reading glasses. "I'm suggesting that something unusual happened in Kilbaha," Sean replied carefully. something that defies conventional explanation. Ghost stories always arise around tragic deaths, especially those of children, the professor said dismissively. It's how communities process grief and unexplained loss. Sean hesitated, then placed a small envelope on the professor's desk. I took these photographs near the site where Bridget allegedly jumped into the sea. I was alone on the beach that day. The professor opened the envelope and examined the black and white photographs with a frown. Most showed empty stretches of coastline atmospheric, but unremarkable. But the final image caught his attention. In the distance, nearly at the edge of the frame, two small figures could be seen standing on a rocky outcrop. The image was blurry, possibly due to movement, at the moment the shutter clicked, but there was something unsettling about it nonetheless. Children playing on the rocks, the professor said with a shrug, though his voice lacked conviction. I spoke to the local school principal before I left, Sean said quietly. There are no red-haired twin girls in the village or surrounding area. Haven't been for decades. The professor handed the photographs back without comment, but his hand trembled slightly. Sean's thesis received high marks, though he omitted some of his more speculative conclusions from the final version. He went on to become a respected folklorist, known for his meticulous research and careful analysis. But he never returned to Kilbaha, and he never published the photographs he took that day on the beach. In 1997, exactly 50 years after Eileen Sullivan's disappearance, a small feature article appeared in the Irish Times, revisiting the mystery. The journalist who wrote it traveled to Kilbaha and found the village much changed, more tourist-friendly, less isolated with its residents, more concerned with economic survival than old legends. Few locals would speak about the Sullivan twins, and those who did dismissed the story as exaggerated folklore. The journalist was about to leave disappointed when she was approached by an elderly woman who introduced herself as Siobhan Kelly. I was a year behind the Sullivan girls in school, Siobhan explained, inviting the journalist to tea in her cottage overlooking the sea. Not that I knew them well. They kept to themselves mostly, but there was something about them that the stories never quite capture. What's that? The journalist asked, intrigued. Siobhan was silent for a long moment, staring out at the ocean. They weren't quite right, those girls, even before the disappearances. The way they would look at you sometimes, like they could see right through you to something on the other side. She turned back to the journalist, her expression troubled. After Eileen vanished, I ran into Bridget in the village one day. She was standing outside the butcher shop, talking to thin air, as she often did. I felt sorry for her, so I went to say hello. As I got closer, I heard what she was saying. She was arguing with her missing sister about whose turn it was. Whose turn it was to do what the journalist asked, her curiosity piqued. Siobhan shook her head. I don't know. But when Bridget noticed me, she stopped mid-sentence and stared at me with the strangest expression. Then she said, Eileen thinks you should be careful near the water, Siobhan. She says the tide comes in faster than you think. The journalist made notes, fascinated. Do you believe Bridget really was communicating with her dead sister? Siobhan's weathered face creased in a frown. I'm not sure Eileen was dead, and I'm not sure Bridget was either after she vanished. What do you mean? The night after Bridget disappeared, my father was out late with the search party. I couldn't sleep, worried about what they might find. I was 14 then. I looked out my bedroom window, which faced the ocean, and I saw them. Both Sullivan twins standing on the beach, illuminated by the moonlight. They were playing some sort of game, chasing each other at the water's edge. Siobhan's voice dropped to a whisper. I watched them for nearly an hour. They never seemed to tire. And when the moon went behind a cloud, they vanished. Just gone. No running away, no hiding. Gone like they'd never been there at all. The journalist left Kilbaha with more questions than answers. Her article generated a brief flurry of interest in the old case, but no new evidence emerged. The mystery of the Sullivan twins remained unsolved. In 2007, a marine biology team conducting a survey of the coastline made an unexpected discovery. Using advanced sonar equipment, they detected a series of previously unmapped underwater caves extending far beneath the cliffs of Loophead Peninsula. Some of these caves had air pockets large enough for a human to survive in, even when the outer chambers were completely submerged at high tide. The team sent divers to explore the most accessible of these caves, and in one large chamber approximately half a mile from the shore, reachable only through a complex underwater passage, they made an unexpected discovery. A small collection of objects, arranged on a natural stone shelf well above the waterline, remains of a child's shoe, similar to 1940s styles a hairbrush containing strands of red hair, and most bizarrely, a small hand-carved wooden doll with two heads. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site suggested they had been placed there in the late 1940s or early 1950s. The discovery reignited interest in the Sullivan case, with some theorizing that one or both girls might have found a way to survive in the extensive cave system, at least for a time. But how could children navigate the treacherous underwater passages? And why would they create such an elaborate shrine deep within the earth? The questions multiplied with each new piece of evidence. In 2017, an elderly woman named Rose Fleming contacted the producers of a popular paranormal investigation television show that was planning an episode on the Sullivan twins. Rose, then living in a nursing home in Galway, claimed to have information about the case that she had kept secret for 70 years. The producers visited her expecting yet another second-hand story or local legend. What they recorded instead was a first-hand account that cast the entire mystery in a new and disturbing light. I was Eileen Sullivan's best friend. Rose began, her voice frail, but her mind still sharp at 89. Perhaps her only friend outside of Bridget. The twins kept to themselves mostly, but Eileen and I shared a desk at school, and sometimes she would confide in me. Rose's gnarled hands twisted in her lap. A few weeks before she disappeared, Eileen told me something strange. She said that she and Bridget had found a special place, a cave near the beach that had a secret chamber inside. She said they had been taking things there, creating a home away from home. Did she say why, the interviewer asked? Rose paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. She said they were practicing what the interviewer asked, confused. Practicing being apart. Rose's faded blue eyes filled with tears. Eileen told me that she and Bridget had made a pact. They wanted to see if they could still communicate, even when they couldn't see each other. They had this theory that because they were twins, they shared a special connection that worked even across distances. The interviewer leaned forward, intrigued. So you think Eileen's disappearance was planned? Some sort of experiment? Rose shook her head slowly. I don't know if what eventually happened was planned, but I do know that Eileen was fascinated by stories of twins who could sense when the other was in danger or know what the other was thinking. She used to cut articles out of magazines about twins separated at birth who lived parallel lives. She was obsessed with the idea. Did you tell the authorities this after she disappeared? No. Rose looked down ashamed. I was afraid. The day before Eileen vanished, she told me something else. She said that she and Bridget had discovered they could do more than just communicate silently. She said they had learned how to trade places. Trade places? The interviewer repeated, confused. You mean switch identities? No, Rose's voice dropped to a whisper. She said they could trade which one was here and which one was there. Those were the words she used. She wouldn't explain further, but she made me promise that if anything strange happened, I wouldn't tell anyone what she'd said. She made me swear on my mother's life. The interviewer was silent for a moment, processing this information. And did you notice any changes in Bridget after Eileen disappeared? Rose nodded slowly. She was different. Everyone thought it was grief, but it was more than that. Sometimes, she didn't seem like Bridget at all. You mean she seemed like Eileen, the interviewer asked. Yes. Rose looked directly into the camera, her expression haunted. And sometimes, just sometimes, I would catch her looking at her reflection with the strangest expression, like she was surprised by what she saw there. The television episode featuring Rose's testimony became one of the most watched in the series' history. Paranormal enthusiasts seized on her account as evidence of something supernatural, while skeptics suggested that Rose was either misremembering events from 7 decades earlier or fabricating a more interesting story for television. But Rose Fleming stood by her account until her death 6 months later. In her personal effects, her grandniece discovered a small diary from 1947, which contained entries that corroborated much of what Rose had claimed on camera, including Eileen's talk of a special cave and the twins' experiments with their connection. The final entry dated November 12, 1947. The day before Eileen's disappearance read simply, "Eileen told me today that tomorrow is the big test." She seemed excited, but scared. She made me promise again not to tell what she and Bridget are doing no matter what happens after. I don't like it, but I promised. In 2022, 75 years after the first disappearance, a team of spelunkers and marine archaeologists launched the most thorough exploration of the Loophead cave systems ever undertaken. Using advanced underwater drones and 3D mapping technology, they created a comprehensive model of the extensive network of caverns, tunnels, and air chambers that honeycomb the peninsula. What they discovered astonished them. The caves were far more extensive than previously thought, with some passages extending over 2 miles inland. More significantly, they found evidence of human habitation in multiple chambers. Not just modern graffiti from adventurous tourists, but older signs of prolonged use, remains of cooking fires, crude tools fashioned from driftwood and stone, even primitive drawings on the walls of the deepest chambers. Most of these signs dated back centuries, suggesting the caves had been used by smugglers, perhaps even as far back as the Viking era. But in one remote chamber, accessible only via a narrow underwater passage that opened into a large, air-filled cavern, they found something more recent and more disturbing. On the walls, illuminated by their diving lights, were hundreds of pairs of handprints, child-sized handprints pressed into the soft clay of the cave walls, hardened over time. Some appeared to be decades old, others much more recent. And beneath these handprints, scratched into the stone, were initials and dates, dozens of them spanning from the 1940s to as recently as the early 2000s. Among these markings, clearly visible in the center of the wall, were 2 sets of handprints larger than the others, with the initials TS under one and BS under the other, followed by multiple dates ranging from 1947 to 1997. The discovery made international news, raising disturbing questions. Had the Sullivan twins actually survived in the caves? Had others found them there over the decades? Were the other handprints evidence of visitors or of other children who had vanished from the area over the years? Local authorities reopened the investigation, comparing the initials found in the cave to records of missing persons from County Clare and surrounding counties. Several matches were found, including children who had disappeared for days or weeks before returning with little or no memory of where they had been. As news of the discovery spread, more stories emerged from locals and visitors to the area. Accounts of hearing children's laughter coming from empty stretches of beach, of glimpsing red-haired twins running along the cliffs at dusk, and of experiencing lost time while walking alone near the shoreline. A local historian combing through parish records made another unsettling discovery. The Sullivan twins weren't the first identical twins to vanish in the area. In 1847, exactly 100 years earlier, twin girls from a family named O'Connor had disappeared while collecting shellfish during the height of the Great Famine. One body was eventually found. The other was never recovered. And in 1747, twins from the Murphy family had vanished while playing near the cliffs. Their disappearance coincided with reports of strange lights seen over the ocean for several nights afterward. The pattern suggested something cyclical, something that returned to Loophead Peninsula every 100 years, drawn perhaps to twins and the unique connection they shared. In January 2023, a novelist researching the Sullivan case for a book rented a cottage near Kilbaha for the winter. Maria Doyle was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of the mystery. The reported communication between the twins after one had vanished, and the possible FOIA the word Rose Fleming's testimony suggested. Maria spent her days interviewing locals and her evenings writing in the small cottage overlooking the Atlantic. The winter storms made the coastline dangerous and the caves inaccessible. But she was content to gather oral histories and work on her manuscript until spring brought better conditions for exploration. One night during a particularly violent storm, Maria was awakened by what sounded like tapping on her bedroom window. At first, she dismissed it as a branch blown by the wind. But the tapping continued, rhythmic, deliberate, almost like Morse code. When she finally gathered the courage to look, she saw them. Two small faces pressed against the glass, identical down to the constellation of freckles across their noses. Twin girls with fiery red hair soaking wet, despite the protective overhang above the window. Their green eyes reflected the dim light from Maria's bedside lamp, shining like those of cats. For a moment, Maria was frozen in terror. Then one of the girls smiled a smile that was both childlike and ancient, and pressed her palm against the glass. The other twin followed suit. Their handprints left no moisture on the window, despite their drenched appearance. Then as one, they beckoned to her, clearly inviting her to come outside. Maria did what any rational person would do. She turned on every light in the cottage and called the local police. By the time a squad car arrived 30 minutes later, the storm had subsided and there was no sign of anyone having been outside her window. No footprints in the mud, no disturbed vegetation. The young officer who responded to the call was sympathetic but skeptical. "You're not the first to see them, miss," he said almost apologetically. "They appear to people who take too strong an interest in their story. My grandmother saw them back in the 60s when she was a girl." What do they want?" Maria asked, still shaken by the experience. The officer shrugged. "No one knows for certain but those who follow them. They don't always come back." Maria checked out of the cottage the next morning and returned to Dublin, abandoning her book project. Some mysteries, she decided, were better left unexplored. In the summer of 2024, a group of teenagers from Kilbaha made a macabre discovery while exploring one of the more accessible sea caves during an exceptionally low tide. Deep within the cave, in a chamber that would be completely submerged most of the time, they found what appeared to be human remains, specifically the bones of two children side by side, on a natural stone shelf, well above the normal high tide mark. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the remains were those of two female children, approximately 10 to 12 years old at the time of death, and likely related, given certain genetic markers. Carbon dating placed the time of death somewhere between 1940 and 1960, though the margin of error was significant due to the effects of saltwater exposure on the remains. Most eerily, the bones showed no signs of trauma or violence. Whatever had caused the deaths of these two children, it had left no mark on their remains. The prevailing theory among investigators was that the remains belonged to Eileen and Bridget Sullivan, and that Eileen had not drowned, as originally believed, but had found refuge in the cave only to become trapped or to succumb to exposure or starvation. Bridget, they suggested, had somehow found her way to the same cave after her disappearance in 1948. Perhaps drawn by the same curiosity that had led her sister there, only to meet the same fate. It was a neat, rational explanation that tied up the loose ends of a 77-year-old mystery. The remains were buried in the Kilbaha Cemetery beneath the memorial stone that had borne the twins' names for decades. But it didn't explain the handprints in the deeper cave, with dates stretching decades after the twins' disappearance. It didn't explain the continued sightings of red-haired twin girls along the coastline reported by tourists and locals alike with disturbing regularity. And it didn't explain why in the weeks following the burial, several children in the area began speaking of new friends they had made, identical twin girls who showed them secret places along the shore and whispered about a special game they could play. A game about trading places. The mystery of the Sullivan twins. What really happened to them? Whether they somehow survived their initial disappearances, whether they genuinely continued to communicate even after one or both had died, remains unsolved. Some mysteries resist rational explanation, persisting in the shadowy borderlands between fact and folklore, between the natural and the supernatural. But if you visit Kilbaha today, the locals will warn you about letting your children wander alone along the shore, especially if they are twins. They'll tell you to be wary of the caves even during the lowest tides. And if by chance you glimpse two red-haired girls holding hands at the water's edge as the sun sets over Loophead Peninsula, they'll advise you to look away quickly and head inland. Because the Sullivan twins are still there, they'll tell you in hushed voices over pints at the local pub. Still there, still whispering their secrets to each other across the divide between this world and whatever world lies beyond. Still inviting others to join in their eternal game of hiding and seeking of being here, and being there, of trading places in the endless twilight between life and death. And sometimes on the darkest nights, when the Atlantic storms rage against the ancient cliffs, if you listen carefully above the howling wind, you might hear them speaking to each other. One voice here in this world, the other responding from somewhere else. Somewhere just beyond our understanding. Together yet apart, separated yet eternally connected, the Sullivan twins continue their conversation across the final boundary that divides us all. I'm here, Eileen. I'm here too, Bridget. Can you see me always? Is it your turn or mine? It's always our turn. Shall we play again? We never stop playing. Someone is listening to us. I know. Shall we invite them to join our game?